it occurred to me that I would start with a question for you. You can think about it in the back of your minds as we go along. Does it feel to you as if nature's playing a dirty trick on us by pouring down with rain? Or do you feel good about it?
Pretty good.
Good about it. How many feel good about it? You may all be environmentalists. You know, the good book says the rain comes down on the good and evil alike, and if it doesn't, we're in deep trouble. So I think rain is a great way to celebrate Earth Day. And if you feel like it, you can go and dance under the rain when we finish. Or you can ask a lot of questions until it stops, whichever you prefer. I want to tell you very briefly my history with the climate change issue, because I'm really going to talk about us more than I'm going to talk about climate change. Because the great mystery is why we are so unable to do anything effective vis-a-vis a very great danger that faces the planet. And so far, we're not doing very well. We're doing patches of local things. What do we have to be able to do? We have to be able to think intelligently about the data that the scientists are giving us. We've got to be able to think about how we can cooperate with other nations all the way around the world. Not always easy, especially since as Americans we tend to think we know better than most people. That's a problem we have, communicating. That's the great mystery. Now, I learned about climate change. It wasn't called that then. But I learned about it in 1968 at a conference supported by the Wenner-Gran Foundation that supports primarily anthropological work. And my father, Gregory Bateson, had gotten a grant to convene a conference that had the title Conscious Purpose and Human Adaptation. We're not adapting very well. This is mysterious.
Survival.
Maybe we don't want to survive. Maybe we don't want our neighbors to survive. I don't know. It is mysterious. On the whole, we believe we're in favor of survival. Aren't you all in favor of surviving? For a while, anyhow.
Some days.
Some days. Good point. Okay, in those days, it wasn't called climate change. It was called the greenhouse effect, which is a much better, more explanatory explanation. Because what happens is that when we burn fossil fuels with high carbon content, the carbon, when it's burned, it combines with oxygen, and the CO2 migrates to the top of the atmosphere, functioning like the glass in a greenhouse. Warmth comes in and can't get out. That's why greenhouses are warm in winter. That's the basic story. So it was called the greenhouse effect, and the scientists all knew about it. And in fact, I found out that the first description of how the greenhouse effect works was in 1896. By 1896, we were already some 50 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since pre-industrial revolution. We've been building up this carbon dioxide substantially already. Climate changing was happening. Of course, the records, it's taken a while to get the records complete with very modern archaeological methods, boring ice and studying what the atmosphere was like at different times in earlier history. Okay, and the first person who warned against climate change as a disaster, as a potential disaster for our planet, and advised that we not use so many fossil fuels, was Alexander Graham Bell. Anybody remember who that was? Okay, so he invented the telephone, and he published advising the nation to reduce our use of fossil fuels in 1917. Some people say human beings can learn. We may yet. So the greenhouse effect didn't sound very relevant, didn't catch attention. The environmental movement in this country essentially started with Rachel Carson's work. And what she was noticing was the effect of our use of DDT to kill insects, and it was killing birds as well as insects. The spring was silent because the birds were dying. And eventually we did forbid DDT. I keep being afraid they're going to bring it back. And that came out in 1964. So that's really when public understanding of dangers to the environment started. There were conservationists beforehand, people dedicated to national parks or worrying about specific species. But that's how long we've had to try and think about this and get ourselves organized and do something about it. I don't know when they stopped calling it climate change and greenhouse effect and started calling it climate change, but a lot of people thought that was a good idea. Human beings use an inordinate amount of time complaining about weather, don't they? That's why I checked you all out. You're more in favor of the well-being of the planet than you are wanting to avoid getting wet. So I congratulate you. And then it was climate change for a while. It was global warming for a while, and a lot of people thought that sounded warming, nice. And then it became climate change. And what the title of the phenomenon ought to be is climate disruption, because we have moved from an era of relative stability to which we're fairly well accustomed to an era of what seemed like very violent weather phenomena that are all related with global warming. The ocean level is rising. The temperature of the oceans as well as the atmosphere is rising, which is those two phenomena together make, you don't have very many tsunamis in Kansas, do you? But you do have drought. You do have to worry about your water supply. Tornadoes, you got them. So we're getting more violent weather, which means humanitarian disasters. And we have to get organized to deal with them also. We didn't do too well with Katrina, did we? Taking care of the adaptation of the human beings in Louisiana. So we were in the middle of a long, fairly slow lesson, finding out whether we can absorb and act on cooperatively, nationally and internationally, to slow this phenomenon and to pre-adapt to the new circumstances. A couple of other things that come along with it: forest fires, epidemics of forest fires, and after them you get mudslides, a change in the pH and the acid level of the oceans that affect shellfish. They need to be able to use calcium to build their exoskeletons. All right? Tropical diseases turning up in places where they haven't been known, since we came out of the trees. So a whole set of interrelated things are happening and getting progressively worse. And whatever we do at this point, it's going to go up. The ice is melting in most places, and we're going to have to change willy-nilly, too late, our habits, and many species will become extinct. That's the other thing. It doesn't get talked about. Have you noticed that the people that seem to understand the most about what's happening are in elementary school? But what they mainly talk about is what has been described as charismatic megafauna. Charismatic megafauna. Whales, elephants, tigers, dolphins. Critters at the top of the food chain. Big critters. And that's where kids get involved. And then they learn something about this at school, and they come home and they scold their mothers and fathers about not doing their recycling properly and not turning the lights off and what have you. It's probably the first great ethical movement that's coming into the population from the second and third graders. You talk about it at school, right? Yeah. And you make sure your parents pay attention. Okay, so that's really my subject today, is what on earth is wrong with us that we can't get our heads around this danger that lies ahead. Now, some of what I'm saying today is biased in a certain direction by what was happening in Boston a couple of days ago at the bombing of the marathon. When there were something like 2,000 policemen bussed into the city of Boston, and everybody in the city was essentially on lockdown. They were told to stay home. All the stores were closed, all the schools were closed, the universities, the government offices. Everybody was staying home to pursue the second of the two bombers at the marathon. So I asked you a question about how you felt about whether nature was doing you a good or a bad turn to rain on you today. A second question I want to ask is, do you think we should declare war on global warming? What do you think? Would it work?
Probably worse.
As well as the war on drugs.
As well as the war on drugs. Fair comment. As well as the war on poverty. How about the war on cancer? Do you notice something about how we think we should go about solving problems? Declare war on them. How about declaring war on carbon dioxide? Isn't that a little more precise? Could we get rid of carbon dioxide?
No, we could reduce the use of it.
We can reduce emissions, yes, and should, but that's not what you do in a war. The reason so many people say the war on poverty failed is because you cannot win a war against poverty. There are always going to be some people who, for one reason or another, are in economic trouble, and there are always going to be people that feel they don't have as much as they need, since they think they need more from year to year. The war against poverty, because poverty is relative, is not winnable. The war against poverty achieved some really important things in this country. Improved the conditions of many people. It improved the conditions of the very old, of many minorities. We should be proud of what we achieved in the war against poverty. But you're not going to win the war against poverty. And I can tell you right now, we're not going to, if we think of this as a war, we will lose. One of the things that people were saying after the marathon bombing in Boston was there was an argument that sprang up. Well, actually, two arguments sprung up. One was, we have so much video games and television and movies about violence that we create models for violence. And the other was that we need a lot more medical treatment of people who are mentally disturbed. And that would solve it. But you know, it's a funny thing about modeling violence. One of the reasons they have trouble proving it. When you see a movie about, let's say, cowboys and Indians, and let's say you're on the side of the cowboys. Try being on the side of the Indians. We must have some anthropologists here. Anyhow, the argument goes both ways. Okay, so you're on the side of the cowboys. They're the good guys. And then there are these bandits or Indians or whoever it is, Brits. Do you know what? Both sides are modeling violence. The good guys are modeling violence as a solution. The bad guys are modeling violence as their way of getting their way. When you watch a football game, most people have loyalties to particular teams. I mean, I always sided with Harvard against Yale, I can tell you. Except I could never understand the rules. But both teams are modeling violence. And we as a nation don't think of violence as a bad thing. We think of it as entertainment. We think of it as a way of solving things. In fact, moving a step backwards from the mental image you're having it now of cowboys shooting or football teams clashing into each other, look at our attitude in this country towards competition. We believe, generally speaking, unless you are one of those who does resist the concept of evolution entirely, that evolution occurs by way of competition. That it is a rule, the survival of the fittest is a rule of nature, and therefore we have political parties talking about there are people in this country that are losers and they should lose. And speaking of being able to cooperate and have mutual understanding, I don't want to talk to you about the Congress. Oddly enough, we think of elections as something like a football game. They're about winning and losing. And since we know we're always going to have people from both parties, it would be nice to have an election about electing people who are dedicated to good government, which depends on cooperation, depends on the capacity to make decisions. And we shouldn't be saying all's fair in love and war, especially if it's against the Democrats. Right? It's not tenable. Well, I've got something to tell you about Darwin, too. Everybody in this room heard about the survival of the fittest? Who said it?
Spencer.
You're right! Bingo! Say it loudly. Where are you?
Spencer.
Faculty. Well, I did not know that Herbert Spencer, who was an early sociologist, economics kind of type, coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. And he coined it from observation of the human society that he lived in. It was an observation of the early industrial revolution in England, when the factories were going up and they were full of child labor, and people were locked up in poorhouses when they fell into debt, and there was no social safety net at all. It was not a just society. It was not a caring society. It was a society with a lot of new machines working very hard to get rich fast. It was the world that Dickens described. How many people are willing to admit you thought it was Darwin spoke of the survival of the fittest? I'm impressed. Darwin got it from Spencer. And nature red in tooth and claw? Who said that?
Say it again.
Hmm?
Say it again.
Nature red in tooth and claw. Ah. Tennyson. Right. Now, those of you who are anthropologists know that human beings are constantly making metaphorical comparisons between the patterns of human society and what they see around them in the landscape. Right? They look at the stars, they look at the animals in the forest, they look at the different species, and they say, that's what we're supposed to do. And it is part of our worldview as a nation that competition is a road to progress. Herbert Spencer said, don't help the losers. They got to be weeded out. No social programs, please. Have you heard any politicians use the term loser in asking to govern a democratic country? It's shocking. And many of these arguments are very impressive. We grade children in school so we can sort out the smart ones and send them to the highly selective schools, and they can get PhDs or they can start new industries. We teach children to play competitive games not every society regards sports as a milder form of warfare. What do we regard it as then? Look what happened. We made a metaphor, historically, from human society that was going through a very rapid transition at that point, and projected that onto the entire natural world. And a century later, we're looking at the living world around us through the glasses of that projection, through assumptions based on what Victorian England was like. And we don't think of ourselves as able to cooperate with the rain, the oceans, the poles, the bacteria in the soil. We think of winning, dominating, achieving our goals without looking at side effects. The conference that I told you about that my father organized was based on the hypothesis that he proposed that there's something wrong with human beings. We formulate conscious purposes like getting a bigger rice crop or corn crop and put on blinkers and ignore the side effects. We don't think systemically that every action has a reaction, everything in nature is interconnected with other things. Nature is intrinsically interdependent. Anybody who reads anything about Buddhism, for instance, will have run into discussions of interdependent co-arising. Everything is interconnected. Probably a much more accurate view of the natural world that says, no, we'll change anything that will make it, in the short term, more convenient for us. And we may do it violently. Because when we talk about concerted, coordinated, cooperative action under pressure, what's our metaphor? It's war. At the Boston Marathon, those of you who are listening to the radio, and this was fairly unusual, I think, many of the radio and television stations were talking about the way people were helping each other. And in fact, human beings do that. When there's a hurricane or a flood or a forest fire, they help each other. If anything's in our DNA, actually, is some sense of our need for each other. But a few years ago, well, let's see, in 2010, I brought out a book about aging. And I looked, being an anthropologist, I went and sat in on a research department studying gerontology to observe the gerontologists, see what they talked about. And they talked about sometimes, that it was important to help old people because they weren't going to contribute very much, or could you find a few ways that they could contribute? But it was all deficit, deficit, deficit. So I just sort of listened, and then I started looking around at the amount of volunteer work and childcare and staying on the job that was done being done by people past traditional employment age. And I realized that what we call normal retirement age was actually set in Germany at 1799 or 1801 or something. And average life expectancy has gone up by 30 years since then, and we haven't re-looked at it to ask about what people have to offer and discover and experience. It was all this negative stuff. I mean, helpful, but presumptively negative. There's a problem there. Instead of saying how incredibly rich we are, that we have a population of people that are no longer concentrating primarily on their own children, and in many ways are reaching out to serve the larger society. Well, last fall, a woman named Lynn Margulies, a biologist named Lynn Margulies, died. And I was preparing a talk for her memorial service at the University of Massachusetts. And I was going through the same process I've been going over with you today. It was talking about what we assume about people. Now, Lynn Margulies basically, you all looked through microscopes in high school at some point, right? Amoebas, paramecia, maybe blood cells. And cells have something in them called the nucleus, sort of the executive office. All right? Well, what Lynn Margulies discovered, which has now gotten into the high school textbooks, is that at the very beginning of life on this planet, the first cells had no nucleus, as bacteria do not have a nucleus. They're alive, but they don't have a nucleus. But all the complex organisms that we know about do. Our cells have, every one of them, a nucleus. So how did the nucleus evolve? And after considerable research, and this was when a lot of work was being done about the structure of DNA and so on, she put forward the hypothesis that at some point in evolution, one bacteria was joined with another bacterium, a different one, in a symbiotic relationship. Everybody laughed. She submitted the paper nearly 20 times and it was turned down. Everybody said it was nonsense. It was absolutely against the doctrine at that time. Doctrine, notice that word. This is now accepted that this is what happened. And she has gone on, she went on to show that this is something that has happened again and again in evolution. That the next step comes about through cooperation, not through competition. I mean, that is a huge scientific discovery. When you look at a cell through a microscope, there will be various things that are like organs inside the body of a cell, and they're called organelles. One kind of organelle are the chloroplasts on which our entire food chain depends. Because it's chlorophyll that can use the energy of the sun and the air and nutrients in the soil to make the sugars that are the base of the whole system of nutrition, right? Guess what? The chloroplasts were originally bacteria. They had a problem. They didn't have any kind of substantial cell wall. So they moved into cells that did have. This is millions of years ago. And they've been in symbiosis ever since. And when the cell splits, its organelles split. Okay? Now I want you to notice something very interesting. If Lynn Margulies had wanted to, she could have said that the nucleus was a foreign cell that invaded another cell and conquered it and dominated it. This is not a lecture about gender, but take notice. You know those things you see, again, through the microscope, flagella, the things that allow cells to swim? Well, you sort of look at them. They're waving there. Along comes Lynn Margulies, and she says they were originally separate organisms. They teamed up with cells. They got their food from the cell, but they helped it swim and find whatever it needed to find. Of course, I've seen a lot of Hollywood movies. And when I see a microscopic photograph of a single-celled critter swimming along with rows of flagella, these little legs, or whip-like things that it swims with, it reminds me of a Hollywood movie about galley slaves. The cell conquered them and reduced them to servitude. No, symbiosis. Symbiosis depends on difference. If you're going to get along with another person, another organism, whatever, it works best if both have something to contribute to the other. And the larger scale example that you see all the time is lichen on trees. And they're a symbiotic partnership between a fungus and a green algae that have been in partnership, one providing a home and the other providing photosynthesis for food and trading off in a cooperative relationship for millions of years. So we shouldn't be looking at lions and tigers, though they perform an important function, we now know, in ecological systems. We should be looking at the fungi. They know how to work together. How cool is that? They've known it forever. I think these examples, you can see from the example of Lynn's work and the fact that it could be interpreted in two ways, that the metaphor that you choose, is it a metaphor of cooperation or is it a metaphor of domination and servitude, can have a pervasive influence on what you see. And this is one of the reasons why one of the fascinations of anthropology is to try and see how people in other cultures see their world. Do they look out and see warfare, or do they look out and see an intricate dance of different species and different kinds of human beings, with the benefit going in both directions? They're not parasites. The nucleus is not a parasite on the cell. The chloroplast is not a slave. This is symbiosis. Benefits going in both directions. So when you look at discussions of what are we going to do about climate change? Well, first of all, we're arguing about it. We got a whole group of people that believe it's not happening. Anybody here that doesn't believe the problem's real? You must have been reading those nasty East Coast liberal papers that the radio talk shows attack. Okay. So we know there's a problem. And it must be obvious that the things any one individual can do about this problem are fairly futile. It's actually one of the very big issues for each of you and for me to believe that it's worth taking the trouble to recycle a newspaper or a tin can or a glass bottle. It's just a drop in the oceans, right? So it's not going to matter if I just throw my, dirty cardboard box in the woods. It'll break down in 50 years or so. It's a really hard thing to acquire an image of the world that says that cooperation, that interdependence is the key. And it runs in culture. I got off track and didn't finish the story about the gerontologists. And I'm going to finish it. If you read the literature on aging in this country, what you will find is the big emphasis on, I don't want to depend on anyone else, especially not my children. Right? Widespread agreement. I want to live independently. I don't want to need help from anyone. No handouts. Well, then go read the child-rearing literature. What they're saying about how to raise your 6-month-old, one-year-old, 2-year-old. And guess what? Independence training. Independence training. It's really great for parents when a child knows how to tie his shoelaces. It's a pain in the neck to have to tie them. It's really great when a little kid can wake up by himself or herself and go to the bathroom at 3 a.m. without waking you up. I get some agreement on that. Okay? I'm not saying independence training is a bad thing. I'm not saying independence is a bad thing at any stage in life. But what I will say is there is no such thing as independence. It doesn't exist. You've got to add an adjective like political independence. Okay? There are areas, tasks. There are things we do independently. We depend, however, on the air, and the water and the soil. And probably everybody in this room is aware of how profoundly we depend on bees, and they're dying. It's probably the latest really scary process that's going on. Some kind of an infection being passed among hives and colonies of honey gatherers, which in the process, that's how the plants grow. That's how they're fertilized, how they make seed for grain. We depend on the pollinators, the bees. It's nice that we get honey from them. We don't depend on honey. We could live without honey. But without pollination, we can't. It's that simple. Okay. Emerson, great American philosopher. Selfreliance. Take with you the fact you can't solve this problem. And we can only be solved by a level of cooperation, by believing that cooperation is how things get done, rather than that violence and bullying are how to achieve something. Right? It's a new way of seeing the world for a lot of people, and it's hard not to slip into it. And one of the reasons it's so hard not to slip into it is because there's another tribe that picked up on this worldview. They're called economists. And economists, our kind, there are other kinds of economists with different theories, but our kind of economists think that competition is the most important process in the economy, right? Well, again, maybe it isn't. When the Soviet Union broke up, I was invited to a conference in Croatia, small country in the Balkans that had been part of Yugoslavia and was suddenly independent. Sorry, what an awful racket. And the theme of the conference was, how can Croatia become more competitive? Well, we sent economists to advise them. I mean, one of the reasons there was such terrible poverty in former Soviet Union for the first 4 or 5 years is we said, quick, 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 everything should be in private ownership. It was a disaster economically. And it was dogma run riot, comparable to the Inquisition. People starved. Just as incidentally, they starved when the communists took over. And everything got reorganized to fit their economic theories. So I thought about this. I thought, so what's Croatia going to do to make it more competitive? Manufacture cars? How about computers? And it occurred to me, the only way that Croatia is going to stabilize economically is if they are contributing something that isn't available better and cheaper from someplace else. The way to survive is to become more distinctive, not to become more competitive. And there is a principle in ecology And I'm first going to give you the original orthodox version of it, which is that you cannot have two different species or occupying the same niche in an economic system. They'll be in direct competition with each other, and one of them will die out. Law of nature. Now, suppose you've got two strains of bacteria, because this is something that's been done experimentally as a lab experiment. You've got two strains of bacteria that are not the same DNA, they're separate species, but they occupy the same niche, maybe in a different part of the world. And you put them together in a beaker, in a lab, and observe. And the law of competitive bacteria are great for experiments because they breed so fast. Short life cycle. Okay, so you put them together in a beaker, and you wait for one of the species to die out. Now, the niche that's occupied by a species is not where it lives. You know, the silkworms live in mulberry trees. That sense of niche. It's also behavioral. I wrote a book about trying to explain this once, and I said, well, the people on the subway at different times of day don't occupy the same niche. The ones that go to work at 7 occupy a different niche from the ones that go to school at 9. Right? So they're not in competition for seats, only within each other, within each group. So when people talk about the law of competitive exclusion, they are saying you can't have, it's not just that you can't have two species in the same place geographically. What the niche means is not just what they eat, where they live, what time of day they're awake, their behavior in a larger sense. That's why we, in fact, can more or less live with each other, because we're not so similar that we're always in direct competition. So what do the bacteria do? They move apart. One of them, say, goes higher, closer to the interface with the air. One of them goes lower in the beaker, or whatever. They become more distinctive. They survive not by competing, but by specializing. And that is one of the rules when you're talking to people about entrepreneurship. When you want to start a business, the way to do that is to find what they call a niche market, a group of people that want what you are going to offer, and nobody else is offering it to them. You're not moving into direct competition. So if you're going to start a restaurant, you're not going to start it with the same menu as the restaurant next door. If you want to start a magazine, you find a group of people that don't have a magazine. You know, a magazine for the National Association of Tiddlywinks players. Nobody's going to compete with you. Okay. And some of you are in business or are going to be in business. This is a significant element of business strategy. Don't meet the competition head on. Get around them. Do something that's not just the same. When Wichita State is recruiting students, they're not competing head on with the thousands of educational systems in the United States. most people who come here have a specific reason why this niche fits them. I mean, it may be because they want to live at home with their parents and they're already in Wichita. Or it may be because they like the anthropology museum. I don't know what it is. So here are the schools all over the country trying to have exactly the same thing that they're advertising and offering to other schools. Instead of saying, what we offer is unique. It's special. Take a look at it. Is it what you need? Does it fit your budget, your time scale, your geographical preference, your climate preference, your sport, the major you want to go into? And are the members of the opposite sex friendly? Or the same sex? That's why people make choices. Because we choose the people we love because they're unique. Not because they're exactly like everybody else we know, but slightly more so. Okay. So that's in terms of economics, in terms of business, in terms of the life plan of bacteria and how they behave in the laboratory. The key is not independence. It is not self-reliance. It is interdependence. And the thing that I find the most important in the research that I've done on aging is what makes people feel good. They don't mind if they need some help sometimes, even from their kids, if they feel they are making a contribution. We don't mind being helped if we're giving back in some form. And in that sense, we literally, there is no such thing as independence. It is an illusion. You might as well believe in leprechauns. Now, what all that adds up to, I think, is that we are not going to make a concerted, intelligent, interdependent effort to mitigate and cope with climate change unless we change our assumptions about competition, about how warfare is a way to solve things. Every time you start a war, you're planting dragon's teeth that will lead to wars later. So then your children can deal with the next generation of terrorists who watch their parents being shot. And we need to look at the natural world and realize that the diversity and wealth and wonder of the natural world lies in its diversity. That to look at it just through the eyeglasses of competition and conflict is to miss what's going on. The conference I told you about. The conference back in '68 about, where I first heard about the greenhouse effect. Somebody asked my father to define love. It was that kind of conference. And he came up, there were several cyberneticists there, and he was involved in the early cybernetic work. And he came up with a definition of love that I love telling to classes because it's so weird. It's not what you think of. There's no hearts and flowers. And I think I brought down the whole text here. But where did I put it? Yeah. He said, you might say that the meaning of love, if I say I love X, means that I recognize that X is a system, a living system, with complex interactive functions, wanting to stay alive. And I recognize that I am a complex living system, wanting to stay alive. And that together X and I form an interactive, self-correcting system, potentially, with a certain degree of conformability within itself. And what does that mean? First of all, it means that X and I are going to be different. And I can tell you, people talk about homosexuality, but same-sex couples are not the same. They're not the same. How do you live with another person unless there's some things they're better at than you are, and vice versa, and you need each other? And actually, competition isn't a great rule for living together either. It is symbiosis. That's what we achieve. It's not just what people do in bed. Okay? So, observably, same-sex couples arrive at a division of labor. That's why they like each other. That's what maintains the relationship. And it may mean, don't tell my husband, but I actually can carve a chicken. But don't tell him. Because he enjoys feeling that that's a man's work. Okay. I'm not going to quarrel. I'm choosing wine. That's another one. And heterosexual couples do the same thing. We could do it ourselves, most of it. But we have a division of labor so that each person feels their other person is giving something. Okay, so what he means by conformability is you can get along, you can fit, and you can have a mutuality in the relationship. But the whole definition of love is also a way of saying that the cooperative relationship that exists has a value. First part of it is love your neighbor as yourself. You recognize you have the same kinds of systemic strengths and weaknesses, and you'd like to stay alive. You're both alive. So, first thing it means is love your neighbor as yourself. Second thing it means is honor and celebrate the value of the relationship as well as the value of the other person. And the minute you say that, you realize that phrasing a relationship as conflict or domination or enslavement is not the way to get things done. So, where am I going? I asked you, do you think it would be a good idea to have a war on climate change? We had a war, against the Germans and the Japanese, World War II, and we mobilized. That's good. get organized, work hard, make an atom bomb, throw it at them. I promise you that that is not the model for the solution. Mobilization, maybe yes. But since we profoundly, completely depend on the natural world we live in, we depend on the climate, we depend on the rain, we depend on the honeybees, we depend on the bacteria in the soil. We're not going to get through this problem unless we think of it as a relationship with all those factors. Think of it as a family relationship. Think of it as being part of a larger whole. Think of it as interdependence. A lot of people historically talk about the earth, have talked about Mother Nature, right? I'm actually opposed to talking about Mother Nature. The trouble is there was a wonderful poster for a while that said, "Your mother," picture of the earth seen from the moon, "love her or leave her." Well, if it comes to that, none of us in this room are going to have the opportunity to leave. But since we have all been told by the culture we live in that what we're supposed to do is grow up and leave our mothers, it's not a very good metaphor. Well, there's so much history of Earth as our mother. Thought about this quite a lot, because it's not a very good model. We rape the planet. In fact, Jim Lovelock talks about the planet, as whole planetary system as a living organism. That doesn't guarantee that we're going to treat her decently. It may just simply mean that we will go on exploiting as much as we possibly can. So I've been suggesting another metaphor that you may find surprising, but it does give you a new way of thinking about it. Think of the earth as your child, as our child. We are together responsible for taking care of this superorganism, the biosphere, which will outlive us, as our children will. But as long as we're responsible, we are taking care of them. They are vulnerable. Maybe that'll help. Maybe you want to decide the earth is your cousin, or that your mother. But I think the best metaphor is to think that we are connected, all of us, with each other in different ways. All of us need it. It takes a planet to raise a baby planet. All of us connected to care for the future of this living planet, in the hope that it will be here and thriving long after we're gone, at a time of great vulnerability. And that we can only do that if we work together at it. Bad metaphors are toxic. The metaphors of dominance, of man against nature, of competition, of we rule and it's our right to get everything out of it quick that we can, are going to destroy the planet. It can happen. It's our job to save it. Thank you.